The jungle breathed with a thick, heavy heat that made every movement feel like walking through water. Lieutenant James Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead and stared at the radio message in his hand. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what the paper demanded. 48 hours. That was all they had at IT. Was August 1942, and the Solomon Islands had become a battleground that would decide who controlled the Pacific Ocean. The Japanese had spent months building an airfield on Guadalcanal, a strategic prize that would let them bomb Australia and cut off Allied supply lines. American Marines had fought through hell to capture it just days ago, but the Japanese had destroyed everything before retreating into the jungle. Now that ruined airfield was Morrison's problem. Captain Bradford stood beside him, arms crossed, jaw tight. The captain was a West Point man who believed in discipline and impossible deadlines. He pointed at the torn-up ground where the Japanese airfield once stood. Bomb craters filled with rainwater dotted the landscape like ugly scars. Twisted metal and burned equipment lay scattered everywhere. "Morrison, I need that runway operational in 2 days," Bradford said, his voice carrying no room for discussion. "Our Marines are pushing north, and they need air support. Without planes flying from this field, they'll be slaughtered." Morrison was a civil engineer from Chicago before the war. He had built bridges over rivers and highways through farmland. But building a runway in a jungle while enemy soldiers hid in the trees, that was something else entirely. The ground beneath his boots was soft, almost muddy. Traditional concrete would take weeks to pour and cure. They did not have weeks. They had 48 hours. Sergeant Frank Chun appeared from behind a supply truck, his uniform already dark with sweat despite the early morning hour. Chun was the battalion's equipment specialist, a man who knew every tool and machine like they were old friends. He had worked in his family's hardware store in San Francisco before joining the Army, and that practical knowledge made him invaluable. "Lieutenant, the cargo planes just dropped something strange," Chun said, gesturing toward the makeshift landing zone where transport planes had been arriving all morning. "Steel planks. Thousands of them. Each one has holes punched through it." Morrison followed Chun to where dozens of soldiers were unloading the mysterious cargo. Each steel plank measured about 10 feet long and 15 inches wide. Holes dotted the surface in a regular pattern, making the metal look like a giant cheese grater. The planks were heavy, but not impossible for 2 men to carry. Some pieces had hooks and slots along the edges. "What were we supposed to do with these?" Private Eddie Walsh asked. He was barely 20 years old, fresh-faced and eager, a surveyor who had been measuring farmland in Iowa 6 months ago. Now he stood in a jungle halfway around the world, holding a perforated steel plank and looking confused. Morrison picked up one of the planks and turned it over in his hands. The metal was strong, coated with some kind of protective finish. The holes would reduce weight, he realized, making transport easier. But could this actually work as a runway? Could steel planks hold a fighter plane traveling at high speed? An older soldier, Corporal Davis, limped over with a thick manual under his arm. Davis had fought in World War I and knew more about military operations than most officers. He dropped the manual on a crate and flipped it open to a marked page. "They're called Marston mats," Davis explained, running his finger across a technical drawing. "Named after the town in North Carolina where they tested them. The Army Corps of Engineers designed them for exactly this situation. Rapid airfield construction in places where concrete won't work." Morrison studied the diagrams. The mats were supposed to interlock like puzzle pieces, creating a continuous surface. The perforations allowed water to drain through instead of pooling on top. The design distributed weight across multiple panels, preventing any single point from bearing too much load. On paper, it was brilliant. But paper and reality were often very different things that a distant boom echoed through the jungle. Everyone froze. The sound came again, closer this time. Japanese artillery, firing from somewhere in the hills. The enemy had not gone far, and they would do everything possible to prevent the Americans from using this airfield. "We don't have time to wonder if this works," Bradford barked, his voice cutting through the tension. "Get your men organized, Morrison. I want that jungle cleared and leveled by sunset." The mats start going down tonight. Morrison gathered his platoon leaders and explained the plan. They would work in 3 shifts around the clock. First, bulldozers and men with machetes would clear the jungle vegetation and remove tree stumps. Second, grading teams would level the ground as precisely as possible. Third, installation crews would lay the Marston mat section by section, connecting each piece until they had a complete runway. Chun organized the equipment while Walsh set up surveying instruments to ensure the runway would be straight and level. Other soldiers began cutting down palm trees and hauling away debris. The sound of axes, saws, and diesel engines filled the air, mixing with the constant buzz of insects and the occasional crack of distant gunfire. Morrison watched his men work and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. Somewhere to the north, Marines were fighting and dying, waiting for air support that could only come if this runway was finished. Somewhere to the south, American aircraft carriers were launching planes that needed a place to refuel and rearm. And somewhere in the jungle around them, Japanese soldiers were watching, waiting for a chance to attack. The sun climbed higher, turning the jungle into a furnace. Soldiers stripped off their shirts and worked until their hands bled. Bulldozers struggled against massive tree roots that seemed to reach down forever. The soft ground sucked at the tracks of heavy equipment, making every meter of progress a victory. As afternoon shadows stretched across the worksite, Morrison received word that Japanese bombers had been spotted near the island. They could arrive within hours or days. Nobody knew for sure. What everyone did know was that time was running out, and the impossible task of building a jungle airfield had truly begun. The night brought no relief from the heat. Floodlights powered by generators cast harsh shadows across the construction site, turning the jungle into a stage where exhausted men performed an impossible dance. Morrison had not slept in 18 hours, and his eyes burned from sweat and fatigue. But the work continued without pause. By midnight, the clearing crews had removed most of the jungle vegetation from the runway area. What remained was soft, dark earth that looked more like a rice paddy than an airstrip. Morrison knelt and pushed his fingers into the ground. They sank easily past his knuckles. His stomach tightened with worry. How could this soggy soil support aircraft weighing thousands of pounds? "Lieutenant, we have a problem," Walsh called out from near the survey equipment. The young private had been checking elevation measurements every hour, and his face showed concern that went beyond simple tiredness. Morrison walked over, his boots making sucking sounds in the mud. Walsh pointed at his notebook, where columns of numbers told a troubling story. The ground was not just soft but unstable, with some areas up to 3 inches lower than others. In normal construction, this would be fixed with gravel and compaction over several weeks. They had hours, not weeks. Sergeant Chun joined them, carrying a Marston mat panel on his shoulder. He dropped it on the ground with a metallic clang that rang through the night air. The steel plank sat on top of the mud without sinking. Chun stepped onto it, then jumped up and down. The mat barely moved. "The manual says these things spread the load across the whole panel," Chun explained, his voice rough from shouting orders all day. "One mat by itself is not much, but when you connect hundreds of them together, they create what engineers call a floating foundation, like snowshoes on deep snow." Morrison wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at his confidence. Everything in his engineering training said that proper foundations were essential. Yet here they were, about to lay steel planks on mud and hope that physics would cooperate. The war had a way of making the impossible seem routine. That a rifle shot cracked through the darkness, followed by shouting from the perimeter. Japanese infiltrators testing the defenses. Marine guards returned fire, their muzzle flashes bright in the night. The construction crews barely paused in their work. Everyone understood that the enemy wanted to delay or destroy this project, which meant the project must be important enough to die for as dawn broke on the second day. The bulldozers had finished their brutal work. The runway area was as level as it would ever be, though still far from perfect. Now came the real test. Morrison gathered his installation teams and explained the procedure one more time. Each Marston mat weighed 66 pounds. 2 soldiers would carry a panel to the correct position, where it would be connected to the previous mat using the interlocking edges. Special pins would lock the connection points, creating a continuous surface. The mats would be laid in a running bond pattern, like bricks in a wall, to maximize strength and prevent gaps. The first panel went down at exactly 6 in the morning. Two soldiers positioned it carefully while Chun checked the alignment. A third soldier hammered pins through the connection points. The sound of metal striking metal became the rhythm of progress, a constant ringing that echoed across the jungled by mid-morning. They had covered 50 feet of runway. Morrison walked along the completed section, testing each connection point. The mats felt solid beneath his boots, but the real test would come when a 5-ton fighter plane landed at over 100 miles per hour. The temperature climbed past 100 degrees. Soldiers worked in rotation, 20 minutes on and 10 minutes off, drinking water constantly to avoid heat stroke. Medical corpsmen moved through the crews, watching for signs of heat exhaustion. 2 men collapsed and had to be carried to the shade, their bodies unable to handle the combination of heat, humidity, and physical labor. Private Walsh discovered a new problem around noon. A section of ground near the center of the planned runway had subsided overnight, creating a depression almost 4 inches deep. If they laid mats over this soft spot, it might create a bump or weak point that could flip a landing aircraft. Morrison stared at the problem area and felt his carefully constructed timeline crumbling. They could not skip this section, and they could not take time to properly stabilize the ground. Chun walked around the depression, studying it from different angles, his mind working through engineering calculations. What if we double layer it? Chun suggested, pointing at a stack of extra mats. Put down 1 layer of mats first, then another layer on top. That will bridge the soft spot and distribute weight even better. It was unorthodox, and the manual said nothing about double layering. But Morrison could see the logic. 2 layers would create a stiffer platform that could span weak areas without relying on the ground beneath. The question was whether they had enough mats to spare. Walsh checked the inventory numbers while Morrison calculated load requirements. After 10 minutes of quick math on the back of a supply form, they decided to try Chen's plan. It would use an extra 40 mats, leaving almost no margin for error if they encounter more problems, but it might work. The double-layer installation took 3 hours instead of 1. Every mat had to be positioned precisely to maintain alignment across both layers. Soldiers hammered pins until their arms ached, sweat pouring down their faces, hands blistered and raw. But when Morrison walked across the finished section, it felt as solid as concrete that by late afternoon, thunderclouds gathered on the horizon. The jungle grew darker despite the early hour. Wind began to pick up, bending the palm trees and sending leaves swirling through the air. Morrison looked at the sky and knew their luck had run out. A tropical storm was coming, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The rain arrived like an enemy assault, sudden and overwhelming. One moment the sky was merely dark and threatening. The next moment, water poured down in sheets, so thick that Morrison could barely see 10 feet in front of him. Within minutes, the entire construction site became a churning sea of mud and confusion. Captain Bradford appeared through the downpour, his uniform soaked black. He grabbed Morrison's shoulder and shouted to be heard over the roaring rain. "Do we stop work until this passes?" Morrison looked at his men struggling in the storm. They had completed about 60% of the runway. Another 12 hours of work remained under normal conditions, but these were not normal conditions. If they stopped now, the mud might become impassable. Equipment could sink and become stuck. Worst of all, they would lose precious hours they could not afford to waste. "We keep going," Morrison shouted back. Bradford nodded and disappeared into the rain to spread the word. The decision to continue working in the storm was either brilliant or insane. Morrison was not sure which. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Soldiers worked by touch and memory, their hands finding the edges of steel mats through the darkness and rain. Floodlights created strange halos in the downpour, barely penetrating the wall of water. Sergeant Shin moved through the chaos like a ghost, checking connections and guiding teams. His practical experience became vital as normal procedures fell apart. He showed soldiers how to feel for the interlocking edges by running their fingers along the metal, how to tell if a pin was seated properly just by the sound it made when struck. Private Walsh had tied a rope around his waist and was wading through knee-deep water, trying to check if the runway remained level. The surveying instruments were useless in the storm, so he resorted to a more primitive method, using a long wooden board as a straight edge. It was crude, but effective. What Morrison had feared most was the ground turning into soup and swallowing their work. But something unexpected happened instead. The perforations in the Marston mats, those holes that had seemed like a simple weight-saving measure, began to serve a more important purpose. Water poured through the holes instead of pooling on the surface. The runway drained like a giant sieve. Around midnight, Morrison made a discovery that changed everything. He was walking across a completed section when he noticed that the mats were actually gripping better in the wet conditions. The steel surface, slick when dry, gained traction when wet. Rain washed mud and debris through the perforations, essentially cleaning the runway as it fell. The interlocking system also proved more valuable than anyone had realized. Because the mats were connected but not rigidly fixed, they could move slightly as the ground beneath them shifted and settled. Instead of cracking like concrete would, the steel panels flexed and adjusted. They were not fighting the jungle. They were adapting to it. But the storm brought danger beyond just rain. Lightning split the sky every few minutes, turning night into day with brilliant white flashes. Thunder rolled across the jungle like artillery fire. Morrison ordered all soldiers to remove their helmets and stay away from the bulldozers and other large metal objects. One man was knocked unconscious when lightning struck a tree 50 feet away, but he recovered after a few minutes. The wind picked up until it became a physical force that pushed against every movement. Soldiers linked arms to keep from being blown over. Loose equipment tumbled across the worksite like toys. One gust lifted an empty fuel drum and sent it bouncing down the partially completed runway until it splashed into the jungle beyond. Through it all, the work continued. Teams of soldiers formed human chains, passing Marston mats from the supply area to the installation point. Others hammered pins by feel, their rhythm unbroken despite the chaos. The sound of metal on metal continued through the storm, a defiant declaration that rain and wind would not stop them. Dawn arrived slowly, the black night gradually turning to gray as the storm began to weaken. By 7 in the morning, the rain had reduced to a steady drizzle. Exhausted men stood in the mud and looked at what they had accomplished. Another 20% of the runway was complete. They had worked through the worst of the storm and somehow survived. But the morning light revealed new problems. Several sections of mats had shifted slightly during the storm, creating small gaps and misalignments. These would need to be fixed before any aircraft could land safely. Additionally, some perimeter areas had washed out completely, requiring fresh earth and re-leveling. Morrison felt like his bones had turned to water. His hands shook from exhaustion. His clothes were so wet and muddy that he barely looked human. Around him, soldiers were collapsing where they stood, too tired to walk to the rest tents. Medical corpsmen moved through the site, checking vital signs and administering caffeine pills to those who needed to keep working. Captain Bradford ordered a 2-hour rest period for all personnel. Coffee appeared from somewhere, hot and strong enough to strip paint. Soldiers sat in the mud drinking it, too tired to care about the discomfort. A few managed to reach the tents and fell asleep instantly, snoring before their heads hit the ground. During the rest period, Chun and Walsh inspected the completed sections and made a list of repairs needed. Morrison joined them, forcing his exhausted brain to focus on problems and solutions. The double-layered section over the soft spot had held perfectly. In fact, it had performed better than the single-layer sections around T8 at T9 in the morning. Work resumed. The soldiers moved like zombies, but they moved. Repair crews fixed the misaligned sections while installation teams continued laying new mats. The end of the runway was finally in sight, both literally and figuratively. Then a radio message arrived that changed everything. Japanese bombers had been spotted leaving their base in Rabaul. over 600 miles away. They were heading toward Guadalcanal. Estimated arrival time was late afternoon. Morrison looked at his watch and did the math. They had approximately 8 hours to finish the runway, or American forces would face enemy bombers without fighter protection. The news about incoming Japanese bombers spread through the construction site like electricity. Soldiers who had been moving slowly suddenly found new energy. The abstract 48-hour deadline had become concrete and deadly. Enemy aircraft were coming, and only a completed runway could save the Marines fighting in the northern jungles. Morrison gathered his section leaders and looked each man in the eye. Chun, his face gray with fatigue, but his jaw set with determination. Walsh, so young but no longer innocent, his hands wrapped in bandages to cover the blisters. Davis, the old World War I veteran who had seen worse and survived. A dozen other men who had become brothers through shared misery and impossible labor. "We have enough mats to finish the main runway," Morrison told them, his voice hoarse from shouting over machinery for 2 days. "But we still need taxiways so planes can get to and from the runway. We still need parking hardstands so aircraft can be serviced and armed. We need at least the basics, or this airfield is useless." The math was brutal. They had perhaps 7 hours before enemy bombers arrived. Installing the remaining runway sections would take 3 hours if everything went perfectly. That left 4 hours for taxiways and parking areas. Under normal circumstances, that work would take 2 full days. Nothing about this situation was normal. Chun made a suggestion that bordered on desperate. What if we only do partial taxiways? Just enough to connect the runway to a couple of parking spots. We can expand later once planes are actually here. Morrison knew it violated every engineering principle he had learned. Proper airfield design required redundancy and multiple access routes. But Chun was right. They needed function, not perfection. They needed something that worked right now, not something that would be ideal next week. The decision was made. They would finish the main runway first, then build a single taxiway to 2 parking hardstands. It was the minimum possible infrastructure to operate fighter planes. Everything else would have to wait. The installation pace increased to something that seemed superhuman. Soldiers worked in a frenzy, no longer rotating in shifts, but simply continuing until they physically could not move anymore. Medical corpsmen administered more caffeine pills and sugar water to keep men on their feet. Some soldiers were hallucinating from exhaustion, but kept working anyway, driven by something deeper than orders or duty. Private Walsh found Morrison around noon with a problem that threatened to unravel everything. The final section of runway, the last 200 feet before the end, crossed an area where underground water was seeping up through the soil. The ground was not just soft, but actively wet, almost like quicksand. Mats laid on this section began to sink slowly, creating a visible depression. Morrison stared at the problem and felt his mind going blank from exhaustion. He had solved every other challenge through engineering knowledge and practical compromise, but this was different. This was nature actively working against them, and nature was patient while they had no time left. Corporal Davis limped over, having heard about the problem. The old soldier studied the wet ground and then started laughing, a rough sound that was more bitter than amused. "In France during the last war, we had mud that swallowed horses," he said. "We fixed it with fascines. Bundles of sticks and branches laid down to create a firm base. The idea was ancient, something Roman soldiers might have used 2,000 years ago. But ancient did not mean wrong. Morrison ordered crews to cut palm branches and small trees from the jungle. They bundled the wood with wire and rope, creating long cylindrical fascines about a foot thick. These were laid across the wet area in a grid pattern, then covered with dirt to create a firmer foundation. The Marston mats went down over this improvised base, and miraculously, they held. The fascines distributed weight and prevented sinking. Combined with the mat's natural weight distribution, the system worked well enough. It would never pass an engineering inspection in peacetime, but this was war, and good enough was all they needed. By mid-afternoon, the main runway was complete. Morrison walked its entire length, checking every connection point, and looking for problems. The surface was not perfect. Some sections were slightly higher than others. The alignment wandered a bit instead of being perfectly straight. But it was solid, functional, and most importantly, finished. The taxiway installation went faster because everyone now understood the system. Mats went down in smooth coordination, teams working together with the precision of practiced dancers. Hammer blows rang out in constant rhythm. Supply trucks shuttled between the storage area and installation point without pause. Japanese aircraft reconnaissance had been spotted circling at high altitude, taking pictures. The enemy knew something was happening at Guadalcanal, but they could not know how close the Americans were to completion. Or perhaps they did know, which would explain why bombers were coming. Either way, it had become a race against time and death at T4 in the afternoon, with roughly 90 minutes until the estimated bomber arrival. The last mat of the taxiway was hammered into place. Morrison wanted to collapse right there on the steel surface, but work remained. The parking hardstands needed completion, and the runway required a final inspection. Captain Bradford appeared with a radio handset. "Morrison, I have a test pilot inbound. He's going to attempt a landing in 30 minutes. If the runway holds, we can start bringing in fighters. If it fails..." He did not finish the sentence. Everyone knew what failure meant. Morrison felt his stomach twist into knots. In 30 minutes, all their work would be tested under the worst possible pressure. A pilot would risk his life landing on a runway built in mud and rain by exhausted soldiers using untested technology. And if that pilot crashed, if the runway failed, Japanese bombers would arrive unopposed to destroy everything the Marines had fought to capture. Walsh appeared beside Morrison, his young face showing a mixture of fear and excitement. "Sir, if this works, we change the war. If this works, we prove that engineers can build miracles." Morrison wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at his confidence. In 30 minutes, they would know if their miracle was real or just a beautiful failure. The sound of aircraft engines reached them before the plane appeared. Morrison stood at the edge of the runway with his entire battalion, every man holding his breath. The test pilot was flying AP-38 Lightning, a twin-engine fighter that weighed over 12,000 pounds fully loaded. If the Marston mat runway could hold that, it could hold anything. The P-38 appeared as a small in the bright afternoon sky, growing larger as it descended. The pilot made one low pass over the runway, examining the surface from 100 feet up. Morrison imagined what the pilot was seeing. A patchwork of steel panels laid across jungle mud, built in 48 hours by desperate men. It must have looked insane. The aircraft climbed, banked, and came around for a landing approach. Morrison felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Beside him, Sergeant Chun was muttering something that might have been a prayer. Private Walsh had his eyes closed, unable to watch. Even Captain Bradford showed tension in the rigid set of his shoulders. The P-38 descended steadily, its landing gear extended like claws reaching for the earth. The nose was high, the tail low, the plane configured for touchdown. 50 feet above the runway, 25 feet, 10 feet. The wheels kissed the Marston mat surface with barely a sound. For a moment, nothing happened. The plane rolled smoothly down the runway, its tires gripping the perforated steel perfectly. No sinking, no shifting, no collapse. The pilot applied brakes, and the P-38 slowed to a stop about halfway down the runway. The engines throttled down to idle. A cheer erupted from the soldiers that could probably be heard in Tokyo. Men threw their helmets in the air and embraced each other. Some fell to their knees from relief and exhaustion. Morrison felt tears on his face and was not ashamed. They had done it. The impossible mission was complete, but there was no time for celebration. Captain Bradford was already on the radio, calling for more aircraft. Within minutes, confirmation came back. A squadron of 12 Wildcat fighters was being diverted from a carrier. They would land at Guadalcanal in less than an hour, just in time to intercept the Japanese bombers. The test pilot taxied his P-38 along the new taxiway to one of the parking hardstands. He shut down the engines and climbed out, pulling off his helmet to reveal a wide grin. "That's the smoothest emergency runway I've ever seen," he said to Morrison. "You boys did something special here." Morrison barely heard him. His attention was focused on getting ready for the incoming fighters. Fuel trucks moved into position. Ammunition handlers prepared their loads. Medical teams stood ready in case of crashes. The entire airfield became a controlled chaos of preparation. The Wildcats arrived in formation, 12 aircraft that represented hope and firepower. They circled once and then landed in sequence, each plane touching down smoothly on the Marston mat runway. As the last fighter rolled to a stop, a radio call came through. Japanese bombers were now 60 miles out and closing fast. The Wildcat pilots ran to their planes as ground crews worked with practice speed to refuel and rearm them. Morrison watched in amazement as what had been empty jungle 48 hours ago transformed into a functioning combat airbase. Men he had seen collapse from exhaustion were now loading ammunition and fuel with desperate energy. 18 minutes after landing, the Wildcats took off again. The roar of 12 radial engines at full power shook the ground. The planes lifted off the runway one by one, climbing steeply into the afternoon sky. Morrison said a silent prayer for those pilots, young men like Walsh who were heading into battle to protect the ground forces. The airfield fell quiet after the fighters departed. Soldiers stood in small groups, looking at the runway they had built. Some sat down on the Marston mats, running their hands over the perforated steel surface that had seemed so strange and unworkable just 2 days ago. Sergeant Chen found Morrison sitting alone near the runway's edge. The sergeant had a canteen of water and 2 ration bars. They ate in silence, too tired for words, listening to distant radio chatter as the air battle unfolded somewhere over the ocean. After 20 minutes, word came through. The Wildcats had intercepted the Japanese bombers. 3 enemy aircraft were shot down. The rest had turned back without reaching Guadalcanal. The ground forces were safe. The airfield was secure. Morrison looked out at his creation and understood something profound. The Marston mats themselves were just pieces of steel, simple and functional. But what they represented was revolutionary. Before this technology, armies had been limited by the need for permanent airfields with concrete runways. Building such facilities took months and enormous resources. The enemy could see them coming and defend against them. But Marston mats changed everything. Now engineers could build operational airfields in days instead of months. They could create airbases on coral atolls, volcanic islands, frozen tundra, or jungle clearings. The reach of air power had suddenly expanded to anywhere soldiers could fight. This was not just a runway. It was a new kind of warfare. Over the following weeks, more aircraft arrived at Guadalcanal. Bombers, fighters, reconnaissance planes, and transports all used the Marston mat runway without problems. The steel surface proved remarkably durable, handling thousands of landings and takeoffs with minimal maintenance. Private Walsh was promoted to corporal for his surveying work. Sergeant Chun received a commendation for his engineering innovations. Captain Bradford was reassigned to train other engineer battalions in rapid airfield construction. The techniques they had developed through desperate improvisation became standard military procedure. Morrison eventually left Guadalcanal to help build airfields on other islands as American forces pushed across the Pacific. Each new project used Marston mats, and each one was completed faster than the last as experience accumulated. By the end of the war, over 300 airfields in the Pacific theater had been built using the technology that Morrison and his men had proven in that desperate 48 hours. Years later, long after the war ended, Morrison returned to Guadalcanal as a civilian tourist. The old airfield was still there, partially covered by jungle growth, but visible. Some of the original Marston mats remained, now rusted and worn, but still connected, still holding. He walked along the runway one more time and remembered the impossible mission that had seemed destined to fail. The jungle had tried to defeat them. The enemy had tried to stop them. Exhaustion and doubt had tried to break them. But a group of ordinary soldiers with simple steel mats and extraordinary determination had accomplished something that changed history. And that, Morrison realized, was the real miracle of war.